Okay, hi. My name is Robbie Weinmann-Smith. I'm a grad student at the University of Florida and at Los Alamos National Lab. And today I'll be talking about the AMLI neutron spectrum. So first, the two major outcomes for this work. The first one was that we were able to characterize a large number of AMLI sources and compare them to each other. A lot of people have measured in the literature individual AMLI sources one at a time, and so this was the first work that really looked at a lot of them at the same time. And then the second outcome was that we were able to make spectra that were specific to first individual sources and then also specific to a series of sources at the same time, so that if you have a gamatron C-series source in your lab, you can use the spectra that we've generated that's specific to a gamatron C-series measurements, and you'll know that it's more accurate and more specific to your source than a generic spectra, generic AMLI spectra. So first I'll talk about the applications for AMLI and its use in active neutron interrogation, and then the physics considerations that go into the generation of neutron spectra for these sources, the current AMLI spectra that exist in the literature, the measurements that we did and the source variations that we found, and then the simulations that we did and how we used those simulations to fit the spectra, and then finally the limitations of the results. So AMLI sources, they generate neutrons. We use them to induce fission in uranium, and then we measure the uranium to get the uranium mass. So more specifically, the IAEA uses AMLI sources in the uranium neutron coincidence collar to verify compliance with nonproliferation treaties. So if you look at the figures, the AMLI source goes into the door of the UNCL, and then a uranium fuel assembly goes into the UNCL, and the detector gives you the uranium-235 mass of your fuel assembly. But one of the issues is that the UNCL requires calibration with known physical standards. And so if you're able to simulate your calibrations instead, you would be able to measure things that you can't, maybe it's too expensive or you can't get a hold of physical standards to calibrate with. But of course, one of the issues with that is you need to know your AMLI spectrum well enough to simulate that, and that's something that we currently don't know well enough. So if you improve your knowledge of the AMLI spectrum, then you enable simulating your calibrations, and you expand the applications, the capabilities of detectors like the UNCL to different geometries, different materials. So this is sort of what goes into generating a neutron. First, the americium alpha decays, and then your alpha particle is in this americium dioxide particle, and it exits the americium dioxide, and it loses energy the whole time as it's traveling through. And so one of the big unknowns is we don't know the particle size of these americium dioxide particles. And so depending on the particle size, they'll lose different amounts of energy. If they lose more than 1 MeV, then they're below the lithium-7 alpha N threshold. And then once they exit the americium dioxide, then they move in and start interacting with these lithium compounds. And so of course we don't know exactly what the lithium compound is either. All of these ones shown here are lithium compounds that are cited in the literature. It could be even some of the ones that aren't cited here. Of course, they can all be at different densities. So there's really a lot of unknowns. And then also people have cited beryllium contamination in these sources as well. And so we actually did gamma measurements in our sources. We didn't see any beryllium contamination, but it's another possibility. And then so in this plot we have the alpha N neutron spectrum for these 3 different compounds. And so they vary by a couple MeV on average for each of them. So you can really see how these small changes in the americium dioxide particle size or what the lithium compound is can really give you a very significantly different spectra just from these small changes. And so of course, there's not really any way to know these things without cutting your sources open, and they probably differ between different manufacturers, between different manufacturing time periods. So you really have a lot of uncertainty here. And that prevents you from being able to analytically calculate what the spectra should be. So as I said, a lot of people have measured single sources for the current spectra. A couple people have tried to calculate what the spectra should be based on physics principles, but all of the generated spectra have the same general shape, so that there's a low energy lithium portion, and the gray spectra, the Geiger-van der Zwaan, only considered the lithium, so you can see exactly where that would probably stop. And then there's the high energy oxygen contribution as well. And so the reason the high energy part is important is because in detectors like the UNCL, they assume that there's no uranium-238 fission. but the U-238 fission cross-section really increases quite a bit in those energies, in those higher energies. And so depending on what your spectra is, that assumption can be more or less true, and it probably also, again, varies from source to source. So as far as the measurements that we took, this is a diagram of the 5-ring multiplicity counter. It gives you the count rates as a function of the rings, and it gives you them individually, and then also gives you the count rate for the detector as a whole. And so what you can do is you can take the count rate for one of the rings, divide by the count rate for the total detector, and you get the ring ratio, or the percentage of counts that were from that ring. And so that eliminates any dependence on the source strength, because of course also the source strength is really unknown. So the circular view is the top-down view, and so if you put your source in the center cavity there, a neutron that's generated in that source has to travel through all of these helium-3 tubes, all of this polyethylene to reach the outer rings. And so, of course, only higher energy neutrons are going to do that, and so that's where this detector gets its energy-dependent information from. And the rings are numbered 1 through 5, with 1 being the inner ring and 5 being the outer ring. So we measured californium sources. First, we measured 6 of those. The reason we looked at californium is because it has a very well-known energy spectrum and a very consistent energy spectrum. So we used californium as a sort of benchmark. And then we also measured 11 AMLI sources. So these are the measurement results for the inner ring. First, for californium, and then also for AMLI, the black line is the average. And so you can see right away, okay, so it's a little blurry. On your left side, the first 3 are the C series gamatron sources, and then on the right side are the N series sources. So you can see the black line's the average. There's a pretty significant difference between the C and the N series sources. And then the error bars are also plotted, so they're, as you can see, they're pretty much insignificant. But the other way to look at it is that for the californium, the statistical uncertainty and the standard deviation between these ring ratios means that the californium sources are almost indistinguishable from each other, whereas that's very not true for the AMLI sources, where the standard deviation is much higher than the statistical uncertainties in the measurements, and the standard deviation is about 5 times higher than it is for the californium measurements. And so we needed a way to combine the agreement for all 5 ring ratios into one metric. So we used a chi-squared value, which hopefully isn't too blurry, but it's weighted by the error in the measurements and also weighted by the relative strength of each ring. And so the chi-squared value for the source that least agrees with the average for the californium measurements was 1.4 e to the negative 6. So probably the one on the far left is the farthest from the average. So that source agreement for all 5 rings with the average was 1.4 e to the negative 6. And the same values for the AMLI series was on the order of e to the negative 5, 1.7 e to the negative 5, and 6 e to the negative 5. So you can see that there's much worse agreement in the AMLI sources with each other. And then these are the inner and outer ring ratios for the AMLI sources. Again, the black line's the average, so you can see that they're significantly different, the 2 series. And you get these ring ratios for all 5 of the rings, which is what's in the table. And so that is the measurement values that we tried to fit our spectra to match. And then we also, so these are averages for the series. We also have these ring ratios for individual sources so that you can generate a spectra for a specific source. So for our simulations, we took the 5RMC MCMP model and we simulated it with californium source since that energy spectrum is so well known. And we got a chi-squared agreement of 9 e to the negative 6. So that means that there is some bias in our MCMP model, which is important to know, and that any spectra that we generate through this method will have that bias built into it. And then we simulated 100 monoenergetic neutrons at different energies in this MCMP model to get the ring ratio, to get the response function for the 5RMC. And so then we simulated the alpha energy of americium alphas exiting different particle sizes of americium dioxide. And so you get a range of alpha energies as a function of particle size, and you use those alpha energies to generate lithium and oxygen alpha N neutrons, and so you end up with a range of neutron energies as a function of particle size. And so you take your energy spectra, you multiply it by the response function, and you get the ring ratios. And so we've measured the ring ratios, we know what we want the ring ratios to be, and so what we do is we adjust our energy spectra until it matches the ring ratios. So this graph is the lithium alpha N neutron energy spectrum for a range between 1 and 7 microns. That's the solid lines. The dotted lines are these values expanded by a factor of 4 in either direction to include for any unknown effects that we're unaware of and to improve the fitting. And then the 5-RMC response function is also shown, the efficiency as a function of energy for all 5 of the rings, and then the detector as a whole. And so you can see where the moderation is fixed, but where the optimal energy for the given moderation for each of the rings occurs. And so these are the spectra that we generated. This is the main result of this work. They generally match the shape of the spectra from the literature, where they have a low energy lithium component and the high energy oxygen tail. And the percentage of neutrons that come from oxygen is listed in the table. And then the chi-squared agreement to the measurements is 1.3 and 1.4 e to the negative 6, so that we can say that the spectra that we generated match our measurements as well as the californium sources match each other. So as far as the limitations, the chi-squared value only relates to the californium agreement. It's not linear. It's not really directly logarithmic. It doesn't have any physical meaning other than how much the californium sources agree with each other. The MCMP model, again, has a bias that we talked about. The agreement was 9 e to the negative 6, whereas the measurement agreement was 1.4 e to the negative 6. And so that's important, that any spectra that we generate are going to have this bias built into them. And so if you want to use these spectra for your detector, you should measure in your detector and simulate in your detector and adjust the spectra to match your measurements, and you will end up removing the bias from our simulation and imparting the bias, whatever bias is in your simulation. And so we assume that the spectra fitting accounts for all of these unknowns that we talked about, the different particle sizes, the different matrix compositions, any effects that we are unaware of. Maybe the encapsulation of the source is not as well known as we think, anything else that we haven't thought of. And so, yeah, basically there's no way to really know these things without cutting a source open, which is obviously very impractical. And so we are sort of moving our calibration, we're calibrating our analytic source to these measurements and assuming that the calibration accounts for all of these effects. And then finally, we need to benchmark these simulations to UNCL measurements to first make sure we didn't miss anything, and then to characterize the spectrum effects on the uranium-235 mass in a UNCL. So it's really easy to say that the chi-squared value is small, but again, that doesn't mean anything, and it would be much better to convert these differences in spectra, these differences in agreement, to differences in mass to A, know how well we hit the target, and B, we would know if it even matters. So it's easy to show these plots where the things are different, but maybe that gives you a difference of a couple nanograms of uranium and you don't really care. Or maybe it is actually a significant difference and you care a lot. And so that's something that we need to look at as well. So to conclude, we characterized the variation of AMLI sources, and especially in comparison to californium. We generated spectra that are precise enough to distinguish between these different sources. We, in general, improved the accuracy in modeling AMLI active interrogation systems with the goal of being able to do simulated calibrations for systems like the UNCL. And in the future, we're going to rework this whole study around the UNCL, redo the simulations and the measurements around the UNCL to answer some of the questions that we talked about. So I'd like to thank the sponsors, the CVT, the NNSA, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
And another poster that's on the wall is about data rescues, and I believe this is a 20-year effort, correct, Paul? That he's been striving to